Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here today to discuss the new book, Mending Education, Finding Hope, Creativity, and Mental Wellness in Times of Trauma, published this fall by Teachers College Press. My name is Emily, and on behalf of the publisher, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us here for what's sure to be a fascinating discussion. We're joined today by the co-authors of the book, Karen Gross, who is an instructor of continuing education at the Rutgers School of Social Work, a former college president, and who served as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Education, and Ed Wang, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School and the director of policy and planning for the Chester M. Pierce, MD Division of Global Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital. In their book, Karen and Ed turn their attention back to the COVID-19 pandemic and consider the ways it has allowed educators to improve the learning across the pre-K to adult pipeline, Their contention is that the sudden and forced changes to teaching and learning wrought by the pandemic created what they term pandemic positives, which can be captured and brought to scale. The book is grounded in trauma and mental wellness theory and includes the voices of educators. The panelists are going to talk about the book in much greater detail, so I won't take up too much of our time, but I'll just say it's an invaluable resource for educators and education leaders at every stage. It can be used in classrooms and policy discussions and is overall just a really focused effort to improve education for every student. Please check it out. And exclusively for attendees of today's event, we're offering a 20% discount. I'm going to drop the details of that in the chat, and they will also be shared in a follow-up email to you all. The discount is only good for a very limited time, so please don't miss your chance to pick up this practical and important resource at 20% off. Please check it out. In addition to Karen and Ed, we are very grateful to be joined today by Sakina Magruder. She is a national board certified teacher with over 20 years of experience with elementary and intermediate school students and their families, and she will be bringing her perspective to these issues. We also welcome as our moderator, Dr. Paul Revel, the Francis Keppel Professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he is also the founding faculty director of the Ed Redesign Lab. Dr. Revel is also a former Massachusetts Secretary of Education. So to all of our panelists, Karen, Ed, Sakina, and Paul, our moderator, thank you so much for being here. Some final housekeeping. We are recording today, and you all will receive the recording via email in a few days' time. So please share it with anyone who you think might find this conversation valuable. We will have a Q&A towards the end of our time together, so please ask your questions using the Zoom chat feature. Feel free to drop those in the chat throughout the hour. We'll be monitoring it, and we'll do our best to get to your questions at the end of our time together. And last but certainly not least, please check us out, Teachers College Press. We publish research-based, scholarly work and practical teacher-focused resources across all areas of education, pre-K to adult, to leadership and policy, and we offer free webinars like this one with our authors on a regular basis. To keep up with our latest, please visit our website and join our mailing list. You can find all of that at tcpress.com. So without further ado, I will hand it over today. Please welcome Paul Revel.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank all of you for making the time for us in a busy season. We're delighted to have you with us to talk about this important book. We've got not only the authors, but a distinguished teacher to talk with us about it. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. The book, Emily's mentioned the title and a quick summary of it, but I want to make a few comments of my own before we get started and get the what I think will be a rich and lively panel discussion going. The title is really important of this book that Karen and Ed have authored, Mending Education, Finding Hope, Creativity, and Mental Wellness in Times of Trauma. So that's an important title that I think we'll come back to various aspects of that in our conversation. I see this as an ambitious, compendious book, compendious look at the COVID experience and the associated traumas experienced by children, their families, and their educators in schools. This is a book that combines scholarship, research, incredible artwork, and people's voices to take a deep look at what happened during COVID time and what we can learn and adapt from that traumatizing experience and our responses to it. It's a work that's singularly devoted to making the most of a crisis and providing readers with a conceptual framework as well as practical tools for scaling up the use of positive, innovative educational and mental health strategies that were developed in response to the COVID crisis, but have such obvious continuing value. The authors envision an enhanced, innovative set of approaches based on what we learned about ourselves as professionals, about our students, their lives, and their families, and about what works in education and mental health. What is unique about Mending Education is synthesizing the knowledge of education and mental health disciplines with our teachers' voices. This is a thought-provoking, Mending Education contains a dozen chapters divided into 3 sections. The first is devoted to examining the origins of what the authors call pandemic positives. The second aims at finding and exploring those positives, while the third envisions adopting and scaling these positives by giving them stickiness in today's context. This is a thought-provoking, positive, practical, and playful vision for a more effective, more responsive, more holistic approach to child development and education. I found it to be enlightening, inspiring, practical, and fun to read. So let's get into it. I'm gonna ask my panelists with sort of a quick warm-up question, and then we're going to get into some deeper questions as we move along. But Karen, let's start with you. The book is loaded with really impressive, inspiring works of art. Tell us why you included these amazing illustrations in the book.
Sure, but first let me say your description of the book is better than I would describe it. So thank you, and I'm deeply appreciative.
Oh.
There are really 4 reasons for the art. The first is one motivated by my co-author, which is that if you don't have breaks in written material, you lose readers. There's a profound lesson there generally in education. And his idea was break up text with illustrations to enable readers to use more than just their reading skills, but also their other skill sets to think about the material. And by the way, there's a really interesting sort of sidelight to that idea that as we get older, we stop picture books, right? And we have heavy text-based books. So the idea is to sort of counter that narrative and recognize that art or drawing or illustrations or charts and tables illuminate text. That's the first reason. The second reason has to do with creativity. And the book has a large set of conversations within it about the importance of creativity. And what better way to show creativity than to display art that was done both by my co-author and by me. And there's a longer story as to how I came upon doing art during the pandemic. But for me, it was a way of sharing sort of a creative experience that's embedded in the book and its message. The third is that it's well known that art and creativity, but art in particular, is a very good strategy for ameliorating trauma. So the sort of message across the 200 some odd pages of the book is to show the amelioration strategy as we go through the book. And I would say the fourth and final reason for it is that participatory art or installation art and its potential for schools and communities is enormous. And view this art then as planting the seeds for creating and using and developing art within our schools and our communities.
Thank you for that, Karen. Ed, turning to you, why mending? What's broken? Mending is a critical part of the titles. What's broken within the system?
Well, let me actually answer that. But before I do that, though, I just want to elaborate on what Karen said. And I always see myself as the kind of the, left brain person, everything is about logic and so forth. And certainly there's a left and right brain differences. So one of the things that I want to add, what Karen's already said, but it's really, we want our readers to have the left and right brain experience. And I think that's where the art came to play. The other thing I just want to add is that art itself actually stimulates thinking and conversation. And I think both Karen and I, and also Sakina too, truly believe that conversation is important in particularly increasing connectedness. I just want to highlight those 2 quick points. And to answer your question, Paul, is that, you know what, naming is always something that has been very important to me and Karen, my co-author. And we talk a lot about naming in both in terms of from a policy perspective and all the way to practices. And so that's how it started. And naming it as mending, I think, is because we truly believe there are practices, maybe even at the policy level, before the pandemics, that these practices and policies, they do work. So I don't believe we want to toss, the baby bath water out completely and is disconstructing. What we want to do is really transforming in regard to education in terms of how we learn and what we learned during the pandemic. So I think that mending is a more appropriate word to use, for the title of the book. And as a matter of fact, kind of going back to a little bit of the arts and crafts, we talk about mending. We provided illustrations on two kind of Asian arts and craft techniques in the book. It's called kintsugi as well as juicy. And that kind of ties back into, again, it's the left and right brain experience and using the word of mending education.
Thank you, Ed. Sakina, to you as an experienced, distinguished teacher, why should teachers read this book?
Okay, well, first I want to say I'm home today because my daughter is sick. So if she runs in, just know that I am also a parent, so I have to do that as well. But as a teacher and teaching during the pandemic, I can tell you this, we were well aware what we were going through. And during that time, we were going through it. So we didn't have any time to really sit back and reflect. So as a reflective practitioner, I feel like reading the book is awesome because you get the chance to see all of the positives that did happen. And what's so great about this book is Dr. Wang and Karen were also able to see those things. And I probably didn't see that during the pandemic because we were just so involved in just teaching virtually and making sure everybody was well, that we didn't see all the positive parts from that. And I think that teachers, if you're a reflective practitioner, this is a great book to open up, read, and reflect upon. And not only that, it will also provide you with strategies that are still relevant that we can use with our students today. So I highly recommend it for teachers. And I think it's just really good to reflect and find the positive. We all know the negatives that came about, but this book really does a great job of finding those positives.
Great. Okay, well, I want to start with a kind of practical problem. There are a number of problems that are facing school leaders and community leaders and families in the wake of the pandemic. Among those are the mental health crisis, well-documented learning loss that's taken place, and chronic absenteeism. So I thought I'd start this question for the panel with focused on that topic of chronic absenteeism. So we have large-scale absenteeism in many of our school districts, particularly in districts that serve large proportions of low income and students of color. Students not coming back to school for a variety of reasons. And I guess the question is, what did we learn during the pandemic? Which of the pandemic positives would help us deal with today's chronic absenteeism issues? And I'll throw that open for whoever wants to take it up.
Well, I'll start. Although I think both Ed and Sakina have a lot to add. And I know, because we've discussed it, that Sakina has lots of thoughts on why students in her school, which serves largely minority students, are not coming back and not staying. They're stopping out in some form or another. I don't think there's one pandemic positive that will cure absenteeism. In fact, the whole notion of these positives is that they work, ideally, synergistically together. But if I were to focus on a few pandemic positives that have the potential for improving absenteeism, here they would be. The first is a better acknowledged connection between schools and communities, and a respect for an acknowledgement of the importance of education. That can't just come from schools. It has to come from the broader world that speaks to the importance of students being in school. That's a sort of meta level thinking, and our pandemic positives fall into the meta, meso, and micro level. So let me give you one micro change. I would tell you that if students were actually engaged in school, if we were doing a really good job of educating them, fewer of them would stop out or drop out. So the question for me then is, how can we re-engage students? And the thing that happened is that many of the positives that engaged not all, but some students were not implemented post-pandemic. We reopened as if we would go back to where we were pre-pandemic, as if we were going back to normal, but there was no normal to which to go back. So why not take some of the engagement strategies that we learned from online learning and deploy them in brick and mortar learning? They have enormous potential. It's like this: don't ban cell phones, figure out good ways to use them. Same thing with pandemic positives. Don't forget them, find amazing ways to use them. So engaging students more effectively would be my micro strategy, and my macro strategy would be to further develop, share the importance of education writ large for us all.
Great, thank you. Sakina, Karen mentioned that you've done a lot of analysis of why students aren't showing up at your school. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because actually we just sent out a correspondence to the parents maybe 2 days ago about being present in school and the importance of being there every day. And Karen, you said some of the most important things that were sent out in that correspondence was, first, connectedness, like the importance of the students being there and understanding the importance of being there. And not only that, just, getting them engaged, and letting them parents know. I got to applaud my principal. He pretty much said flat out to the parents that students are required to be in school. We can understand that they're sick, but they're required to be at school and we need them there. But I think the tone in which he said it, I was proud of him. I can hear the seriousness behind that. But I want to just jump in on some of the things that I've noticed about, like, absenteeism in our school. I work in a Title I school. We're primary. We have about 400 students, so we're a pretty large school. And my population is majority Hispanic. What I've noticed at our school is also, from being virtual, the parents were learning along with the students. So it was almost like a twofold thing, like, believe it or not, a lot of our parents were sitting right next to the computer as their students were actively engaged in school. That kind of made the students feel like, oh, this is important. My mom is sitting next to me. She's learning and growing right with me. And then once we returned back to school, it was just the students going back. And then parents were like, off in the world doing whatever. And now it feels like, oh, it's only on me again. I think that connectedness of the parent and the student both being in school taught the student that, oh, this is important to my mom, so it's got to be important to me. That was an important piece that's kind of almost missing now. The students sometimes feel as though school is optional. I'm not going to lie to you. I see students every day and they look at me like, why do I need to be here? And we have this long discussion about school and the importance of it and the role it plays in their lives, not just now, but in the future. So, like, those conversations also need to be had with students, but I think also with the parents. And so I think we need, as a school, because for a long time our doors were closed to the parents when we first arrived back after the pandemic. I think it's time to bring them back in and have that open discussion about the importance of school, or why is it that their child is having a difficult time coming to school, so that maybe we could start to mend and attack some of that. I agree with Karen, there's not one way, but I think we as educators have to first start with that open discussion with the parents and see how we can help them improve. For some kids it's very much, I'm attached to my mom, I don't want to leave her all day. Well, then maybe we could gradually do something where there's a release, but letting the kids know, this is important, and just, this is a safe place, so you're going to be fine, and we're going to return you home at the end of the day. So maybe that might help. I hope I
Thank you.
answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Absolutely. Ed, before I go to you, I want to sort of tie in another aspect to this question that previews the next question that I really had on my list, which is, I'm interested in the division of labor between schools and the rest of the community in terms of solving some challenges like chronic absenteeism. Reasonable people will disagree over whether absenteeism is a problem of the school or a larger problem of society. It's important to remember, I often talk about students spend 20% of their waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12 in school. 80% of their waking hours are spent outside of school. This book nods late in the book toward community responsibility and community partnerships in doing the work. But I'm wondering, as we think about this problem, chronic absenteeism, what's the community role? What's society's role in this as we think about applying some of these pandemic positives?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent, very complex question. And I will attempt to answer a little bit of that from my perspective of my work, if that's okay.
Yeah,
so
please
I try
do.
to combine maybe both questions, and I will just, as much as I can, I simplify it the way that I kind of understood and in relations to my work. That's your question start with is the increase of absenteeism. I think it's a very complex and it's a wicked problem. And I want to emphasize the wickedness, which is really defined as very complicated. What I would just say is this, just listening to Sakina when she talked about her work experience in Title I school, immediately what jumps on me, of course, is the type of work that we have been doing in kind of in relations to the population health. And this is not only about education, it's about the population health and mental health and so forth. It's what's the impact of social determinants, terms that we use a lot at Harvard Chan School of Public Health, as well as, with HMS. And that because I read actually an aspect of an article or an interview that you were interviewed by Harvard Chan School of Public Health. This probably dated back about 3 years ago and so forth, in the midst of our crises. And so I always look at, what are the determinants that impact in terms of learning, as well as, and I think our ties back into even just very specifically on a symptomatic level is in terms of an increased scale of absenteeism. And then also ties into, I think you did ask about, maybe an example of a pandemic positive related to that, is that I'm going to start with, again, I think that's I love the feature of this book that Karen and I wrote, is because we listening to the teachers' voices. And I think it might be the first one that we quoted in the book is by a teacher. And it's basically said, or she said, that, the pandemic changed how I see myself as an educator.
Mm-hmm.
Because I became more aware of the full spectrum of needs students have. I'm now more conscious of student needs, not only academically and how they individually learn, but also emotionally and how that affects their ability to learn in a classroom, interact with peers, and grow as an individual. So I think that, to me, is one of my kind of pet peeve in terms of the pandemic positives. Of course, my thing is that great, the teachers and the educators now are really focusing about mental wellness, as a full spectrum of the needs of students and their families. And I think that is wonderful. Okay, fast forward, and I'm going to stop because I know that my colleagues here have other things to say, and I'm trying to then broadly address your other question that you raised about the division of labor. Because I think that the division of labor is really coming from my understanding, and particularly with my work with, I think all the educators online here, you know about the so-called, MTSS. And for those that are not in education, I will just say that stands for multi-tiers system of support. And so in addition to, of course, teachers teaching academically, there are the school psychologists, the counselors, the social workers, nurses, and so forth, which is part of within the educational system, within a school that provides that. And we know that the MTSS is a critical part to facilitate, students learning and so forth. So let me put it from that perspective. What I have seen, and also this is some of the positive, and I think addressing to your question also in regard to, whose role is that? To educate our children, to make them to learn and help them to be successful in life. And I think that is, to me, it shouldn't be school-centric. It has to be partnered with the community. School is a capital let's say, of a community. And the question is that what I have seen is that the successful school are actually very much tied in as a social capital of a community, which means to me is that, and by examples that they demonstrated, is that they work together, right? We know that it is great to have a division of labor in the school system, but we know there's not enough school psychologists, not enough counselors and social workers and so forth. So it is almost not possible unless, if education can be truly fully funded. But I think that is going to be a big challenge. It's that then we need to work with the community and to see what kind of partnership we can develop. And I think in some, I would say, school district, I have noticed, there are programs between school and the community in regard to school-based mental health services, or services are not in school, but it's outside of that, in order to increase that capacity to address mental wellness.
So can I?
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
Paul, if I answer.
Yeah, please jump in, but I want to keep it moving because we've got a bunch of questions that we need to get to in the short time. But please, anything you want to add on that school-centric kind of question?
Okay, so I think it's easy for us to talk about connection with community. Making it happen is way harder. So I just want to park that question. I think
it raises also, I'd say, Karen, a question of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the school's responsibility, or is it the community's responsibility? If so, who is it in the community? Is it the mayor? Is it the city council? Is it the United Way? Is it community-based organizations? Is it parent organization? Who takes responsibility for setting up a system of collaboration, many of which we saw actually during the pandemic? It's one of the features that I appreciated most in Boston, for example, of different organizations coming to work together to meet basic needs of children and families and communities, and setting up a network for doing that we should really permanently install in the form of a children's cabinet or something of that nature that keeps us talking about children's well-being. Schools are a big contributor, but they're only a piece of the pie.
So I would share with you that I think that did happen in lots of important ways during the pandemic, including corporate involvement, say providing computers or internet or a variety of services. But this ability to do it writ large is in part dependent on will, as in W-I-L-L, the will of people to make it happen. And when the crisis lifts, the will goes down. And it's also hugely leader dependent. So I did lots of work as a college president that involved the community because I had relationships that I built with community organizations, community members, other colleges, high schools. As soon as a leader in one of those other spots fell out, fell off, went away, that connection didn't stay. So if all of this is leader dependent, that's a big problem. I'd raise two other points, I think. Sakina raised a really important issue. Why not ask the people who are in schools what they think? Like, they have lots of answers. Like, ask parents, why are your kids not coming to school? Useful question. Ask kids, why aren't you coming? Useful question. We may not like the answers, but if we don't know the answers, if we don't ask the questions, we can't begin to answer the question. So I hope the book is grounded in the voices of the people who live in schools, but we somehow forget to ask the people who live in schools what they think.
Yeah.
And
And you did do that as part of your book. And I like your point about leadership is really important, because the momentum toward reverting to the status quo ante is something that a lot of people who in positions of leadership feel pressured to do in the wake of a crisis like this, because people are yearning for stability and they want to go back to the world that they knew that had some balance and less threat in it. And the question is, how do you have a leader who says, we can give you that balance, we can give you that absence of threat, but we can also work in new ways and new directions? And we learned some of those things during the pandemic, like how we might collaborate more effectively with our community, how we might bring the community to the table to care about children's well-being and make their contribution, because we've only got 20% of their waking hours. The community has 80%. And how do we do that? And how do we work together? And we figured out some of those things. Let me shift gears, because I want to get to this. Ed mentioned a quote. I found another one that I really liked on the teacher's role. Here's a teacher commenting: before the pandemic, my role as an educator was as a classroom teacher. I delivered instruction, supported my students in as many ways as possible to guide them to educational success. However, once the pandemic started, my role shifted to that of an educator, also tasked as a community support person. We checked in weekly with all of our school families to ensure they had supplies, food, funds, internet, a computer, and time to do schoolwork. Coming out of the pandemic, we've continued many of our wraparound supports, and it has taught me to engage my students in many ways, not just academically, but to get to know them as a whole person. This shift has been instrumental in being a more effective educator. Sakina, is it reasonable to expect this kind of a significant expansion in the role of our educators, many of whom were trained in and brought to schools for an academic purpose, and suddenly we're opening it up to a much broader purpose in which they may or may not have any background, experience, authority, or even the language to solve problems like homelessness and things of that nature? What is reasonable to expect of teachers, and how do you see the teacher's role as having changed here, and what's realistic?
Okay, that's a great question. Pre-pandemic, I agree with the quote you said. I was just a teacher, in charge of instruction, and I would also communicate with my parents, daily. During the pandemic, I believe and I know that my responsibilities increased immensely. Not only was I the teacher, in some cases, I was also sitting with kids after school on Zoom. I was on Zoom from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 p.m. at night. And in most cases, it was because I understood the importance of being there for my students. Many students had come from different backgrounds, so they didn't have the parents home with them all day. So I understood the quality time that they needed just to be one-on-one with me, and I would draw pictures with them. Now, could that continue on once we got back at school? No, that's not realistic. We already, that's the problem I think that happened. When we shifted back into the building, I think a lot of people also thought that all of those responsibilities that we had during the pandemic was supposed to shift and continue with us. That's almost impossible to do. Like our regular school day, we start in the morning, we end in the afternoon. And a lot of us, our responsibilities should be ending as well. We have families, we have other things that we need to do. And we can't expect new teachers to also understand what it was like and all of the responsibilities that we had during that time to carry over as well. That would be we're asking for a lot of trouble for that. So
Mhm.
I think that no, it's you're not asking for much, but you are, only because I wrote down on my paper limitations. I think one thing I've learned from the pandemic was also my limits. I mean, I might not have noticed that before, but just having that minute of saying, you know what? um, I know that I can't do this right now, and I'm going to stop, and maybe I can do it the next day. And I think a lot of teachers are struggling with that as well right now, is knowing that what are our limits, and we're dealing with a lot right now. I think they're also thinking our responsibility has changed from just being educators till now we're also being guidance counselors, and we're wearing a lot of other hats. So has our role changed? Yes. I think the expectations of us as educators are immense, and we can't meet everybody's needs, but we are doing our best right now. But I also need everybody to shift. I need everybody's thinking to shift after the pandemic and just think, okay, what was it like for teachers beforehand? Because we are like super stressed right now. And I think it's just because we're wearing too many hats and
Yep.
doing so much. And so teachers are in need right now of that, like, what is it that, what is your role? Because I think it's got lost somewhere between the
No,
pandemic and
that's an
current.
excellent point. And I think,
Yeah.
we're dealing with a lot of attrition among teachers, a lot of early retirements. People are exhausted.
Yeah.
And to the extent that people could conceivably see the pandemic positives as one more thing to do, and I'm already taxed, and we're really good at addition in the field and not so hot at subtraction. So what are we going to stop doing to make room to do these more positive things? That's a big question, and always politically tough to stop doing things that you've been doing that people are used to, and that they identify with the stability of the status quo ante. That's a big challenge. Um, I want to move on a little bit because there are a couple of things I wanted to get to before we go to the audience questions, and people should feel free to keep adding questions in the box, and we'll try and get to them. But a lot of this, the third portion of the book is about stickiness, and that, to my mind, is about scaling. So I wonder, Karen and Ed in particular, in a number of the things that you've enumerated so clearly and effectively as pandemic positives, and we've seen some of them get scaled and some of them get left by the wayside. Which things are scaling well and why? And what are the obstacles to scaling as you see it and you encounter interactions with schools and other potential partners for putting these pandemic positives into play?
Ed, you want to go first?
Let me actually just quickly say something, and then I'm going to pass it on to you, Karen, and then maybe I can then react in terms of what you're going to say. Yes, we actually spend quite an amount of time in the book, in the third part, talk about stickiness. It's also, we talk about what are some of the changing moment that we can utilize. And then I think that we did a parallel in the book itself from a public mental health transformation experience that I had, and then try to also, work towards, then what is that in regard to stickiness and changing environment in regard to education. So I'm going to leave the education piece to Karen. One of the things that what I found is that, again, it goes back to your original warm-up questions about mending. Mending is not, as I emphasized, it's not tossing, the baby water out completely, but it's really kind of in some sense transforming what we have done well and then what we need to pay attention to. So with that said, we emphasize, like we did quote about, use the Heath brothers in terms of, their book on stickiness. They talk about communications and messaging. I found that that's definitely is very important. To me, I'm going to add, how do you have sustainable communication and messaging ongoingly? And I think that's why that we included, the public health transformations of mental health system, both in Massachusetts and then also in some of my work nationally. It's the fact is that it takes time. We talked about it is a marathon, not a sprint. since I live very closely to the Boston Marathon route, and I see how many runners that are going through the so-called Heartbreak Hill and couldn't even, let's say, finish of that hill. But I think that trying to answer your question, and I'm going to stop and let Karen say, from her perspective, and then I can come back to it, is that I do believe that part of the stickiness has to have someone in an office, maybe within education and whatnot, to have really a functional and structural responsibility to continue to sustain, to continue to edge away, because it is a marathon and not a sprint. It's a long haul.
Thank you, Karen.
So I guess I would start by saying that if there has been stickiness, well, let me back up. Change is hard. People don't like change. Even people who want change, in theory, don't like it when it actually happens.
Yeah,
Those
good for others, but not necessarily for me.
Correct. It's a NIMBY problem.
Yeah.
Okay, but I do think that pre-pandemic content was king for the most part, or queen. I do think the pandemic showed us that content can't be king, because kids who aren't socially and emotionally ready to learn, who are struggling at home, struggling with mental wellness issues, have families that are struggling with homelessness and violence and all sorts of other things. If you can't get that in check and thoughtfully addressed, then learning isn't going to happen. And I think the pandemic did teach us that. And our respect for and willingness to talk about the absence of mental wellness, I think, is now much more centered. And that's a good thing. That's a pandemic positive. Now, some people might say, oh, that's all snowflaking and whatever. And there's clearly a political agenda here in terms of our capacity for change. But I do think the shift from content being king to realizing we need social and emotional learning is perhaps the biggest lesson we can take away. Now, I would also add this. In the hierarchy of education, our capacity to make content king at the earliest level can be balanced well, and often is, by teachers in primary schools. They are remarkable educators. They get that their students can't learn if they're hungry. They can't learn if they can't sit. They can't learn if they come to school with huge baggage. They get it. Early educators are stunningly good at that. As you move up the educational train, by the way, I taught at graduate school for 20 years. The higher up you get, the more content focused we are, and the less concerned we are, and the less well trained we are for social and emotional learning. That should send a message out there that the next professor who says, my job is content delivery, not any of these other collateral things. No, it's not collateral. It's integral. Social and emotional and content are connected.
Point well taken. We're running short on time, so instead of going back on this, Ed, I want to go to the next thing quickly before we have a final question for each of you. And that is, we're in a time of a lot of division within our society, a lot of debates, some cultural wars of one kind or another, major changes in government coming, particularly at the federal level. I wonder what thoughts the three of you have on how this work will fare in the changing climate that we're addressing right now.
I think this is a really tough one, and I think the climate is also so different. I work through in Massachusetts. Actually, I work through 5 administration, and nationally I work through 3 administration or 4 administrations, and I know they are the ebbs and flows in terms of where the focus and so forth, and then I think these are all so-called the legacy of the leaders. And I recognize that. But I think this is really a new experience for me. Culture war, did not just start about, 3 months ago. It has been around now for a period of time. You know what? I kind of like to see that as, cultural conflict. And I just shy away of the word war. It's hard for me to imagine that people cannot talk. My concern now is that level of conversation that I really believe in, it's happening less and less. And that's my concern when you mentioned that about, really truly it's a cultural war, is that we are beginning even more and more disconnected. And the basic things that I learned, that I believe in, it's about conversation. Conversation to share, conversation to state your opinions without feeling that I'm trying to pull you into my camp or, the other camp.
Right.
And I think that is, I don't know. I don't know what the solutions are, but I'm going to continue my work of encouraging conversations to interact, to have dialogues. And I just found it very difficult now because things have got manipulated from my perspective of not having that type of dialogues.
Fair enough. Okay, quickly to the other two panelists before we go to our final question. Sakina?
Yes. So the book mentions a lot about how when the pandemic first arrived, we didn't have a plan, and we developed plans as we went along. And we try to work through the problems that we face each day. With the upcoming administration, I'm nervous about a lot of the programs and a lot of great things that were created during the pandemic. I'm nervous that a lot of them are going to fall to the wayside, especially in for example, our school, we're a food desert. So, we're providing foods weekly to our families. I'm worried about programs ceasing, and they're really important to our students in their education. But I'm hoping as a school and as a district that we kind of put all of that aside and battle the problems as they arise, just like we did during the pandemic, and develop plans that are going to address the problems that we're facing each day. If we continue along that path, I feel like we'll be successful and we'll be okay. But I also want to speak to what Dr. Wang said, which is the connectedness, which is us just working together. That is the key. And that's how we were able to make it to the other side. And I feel like despite our worries, despite our concerns right now, we will make it and we will survive if we work together and still have that connectedness in our buildings and in our district.
Thanks, Sakina. Karen?
So let me see if I can pick up on both. James Ryan, who wrote an amazing book called Wait, What? And Life's Other
Our
Essential.
former Dean of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Yeah, a remarkable guy, actually. But his book says, amongst his 5 essential questions to ask ourselves and ask of each other and ask of our students, can't we at least agree that? And then ... We're not asking that question. We're asking, how do we differ? Not where do we agree? So I would say we would be well served at the local, state, and national level. And I think there are problems at all of those to ask that question. Can't we at least agree that? We had a school strike in my town here, Gloucester, Massachusetts. The mayor gave a finger, third finger, bird finger to the protesters. Might I suggest that's not a really good negotiating strategy in the short term or the longer term? Come on, we can do better. I hope we can do better. We need.
Good. All right, fair enough. Okay, we've got a short amount of time remaining before we want to go to the questions that are coming from the audience, and there are a lot of good ones out there, so thank you for those. The last question that I want to ask is just to give you an opportunity. We've had a short period of time in a deep and complex book to talk about various aspects, and I've raised some questions, but I'm curious, and each of you would have really only less than 2 minutes. Think of it as 90 seconds to talk about an aspect of the work that you'd like to highlight, that you think is particularly important that we haven't talked about already. Ed, you want to start us off? You're muted. You're muted.
It's part of the continuation of what we talk about quickly about leadership, because I found that it's really critical to have the leadership. In our book and during the time during the pandemic, we found during that time some educators, they were actually very fortunate to have exemplary leaders in their school. And the way that I heard about that through listening to them is that they appreciate the leaders who can communicate, practice deep listening with respect to their teachers, and they see them as these leaders are transparent and authentic. And I think those are my take home of in the educational setting in, let's say, a particular school. That's the practicing of some of our great leaders. And, I know that we can go into, the big level of, on a national level about educational transformation and all that. But sometimes I still believe in that one single school when they have such a leader of that school that they make things happen during the pandemic. And I wish and I hope that they will continue of the characteristics of a leader that I just described.
Thank you, Ed. Sakina?
One of the things you asked in one of your questions were, which were some of the positives that was most important to us from the pandemic, and I wrote down new traditions. I think it was a great thing post-pandemic or during the pandemic for students, parents, the world to develop these new traditions that for students to see, such as my daughter drawing a rainbow and putting it in the window for the healthcare workers, or the healthcare workers in New York City who were banging, or the people who were banging their pots and pans for the healthcare workers. Those traditions that came out of the pandemic, I really wanted to spotlight those, because those are the things that warmed my heart as a teacher, because I think it was important for students to see the community and the positive that can come out of a negative situation. So that was one of my favorites.
Great point. Thank you. Karen, wrap us up on this.
I would say that the point that we need to keep remembering is however hard it is to make systemic change, even small change matters. Little change, micro change is better than no change. So I would emphasize that while it's wonderful to have meta level change and meso level change, micro change counts. It counts a lot. Even if it's only 2% or 3%, that's 2 or 3 we didn't have before. So I would say that paying attention to small change has value.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to wrap up just a couple of comments. I mean, some of the things that I would have responded to my own last question here have to do with the passages in this book that deal with issues of hope and possibility. I've long thought that the main role of an educator, is to be a connector, to help young people connect to hope and possibility, to help them see that there is a place in this complicated world for them to make a difference and to fit in and to make a contribution and to be important in some way. And our job as educators is to help them find that and expose them to that hope and possibility. And we do that through relationships. Relationships are at the heart of all of this. One of the reasons, in my view, that people aren't coming back to school is they don't have strong enough relationships pulling them back. Look at our secondary schools. Excuse me, a lot of people go through anonymously. Teachers are seeing 125, 150 students a week. Guidance counselors are supposed to look after 400 or 500 children. Psychologists, it's even higher ratios. So they don't have compelling relationships that are bringing them back, and they don't have the level of engagement, the deep learning, the applied learning, the opportunity to engage in real life problems that are meaningful in their own lives that motivate them to be connected to the work. And all of this, I think, can be helped with expanding on this notion of community, that third leg on the stool, and what it means and who takes responsibility and how we bring communities to the table on doing their share, not just schools' share, but doing their share in terms of looking out for the well-being of young people and enabling them to get on a pathway to economic mobility. So I think there's a lot there in the book to appreciate about those kinds of topics. Well, I'm appreciative of the conversation we've had today, and the panelists leaning into some tough questions that I was able to put in front of them. Now we want to turn to your questions as the audience, and for that, I'm going to turn to Emily, who's going to come back and join us and curate some of your questions. Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you everyone for a really, really wonderful, thoughtful conversation this afternoon. And thank you to our attendees who have been putting some very thoughtful remarks in the chat as well. So we certainly, no easy questions here either. I thought maybe we would start with a question from our attendee, SJ, who asked a series of questions about a number of vulnerable student populations. Students who are experiencing homelessness, single parent homes, violence and bullying in schools. There's a huge amount that could be said on all these topics, obviously. But I think maybe for this first question, if we can focus on homelessness and K-12. We received some other questions about vulnerable student populations in higher ed, so maybe we can address that in a minute. But for teachers in the K-12 arena, who are dealing with particularly vulnerable populations, for example, students experiencing homelessness, what do you say to educators? Where do you begin? Like, we've been talking about this all throughout. Sakina saying teachers are saying we're wearing two hats, doing too much. We can't meet everyone's needs. I don't. I know we've addressed some of these questions of the importance of community and what you can do to make things sticky. But I feel an interest from the audience in, the specificity for some of these particularly challenging social problems that students might face. I'll share a quick comment from Carol Linscott on this topic. Carol says, in Washington state, the McKinney-Vento Act provides homeless education and support, including housing issues. I hope that other states are also addressing this issue. Seattle has a school specific to the homeless population, which offers a space for parents to rest, showers, laundry, counseling, and meals in place pre-pandemic. I am uncertain as to the exact programs in place post-pandemic. So all that taken together, I guess my question is, what do you say to educators who are dealing with a particular problem of this nature and searching for those kinds of community supports we've talked about? And what are the solutions for some of these challenges that you've seen work? For example, the example provided by Carol in Seattle. And I'll just throw that out to any of you who might have thoughts on the topic.
So I think Sakina should begin because she no doubt deals with many students, or a sizable number, who are homeless.
Yes, we do have a lot of students at our school who are homeless. I know our school in particular is a community school. And what that means is we rely heavily on our community for help. And especially in the area of homelessness, we try to collaborate with different organizations within our community to help combat that and to at least provide support. What I found in my school, to be honest with you, is that a lot of families actually have shared housing, which means there could be a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment and it has 6 families in it. And you're saying, well, that's a lot. It is a lot, but it's also affordable. And it's something where everybody shares the responsibility in maintaining that apartment and everybody still has a roof over their head. So they push a lot of that in our district and in our county where we live is shared housing. But I don't know if there's a particular program per se or the name of it. I might not know the name, but I do know, since we're a community school, if a parent, because I've had lots of students who are homeless, if they said, I'm homeless, it's almost like there's a plan of action in our school district where they actually get the students, talk to the parents, make sure the student is there. They have a plan for to deal with absenteeism. They actually bus the students, no matter where they are, no matter where they live, to our school building. They try to make sure that the parents are set up within 60 or 90 days with services so that they can get an apartment or a place or a safe place for them and their family. So I do know there is, but I encourage, if you're a teacher, that you ask. Like I said, my school is a community school, which means they have planned and they have actually come up with an action plan on how to deal with homelessness in our community.
Emily, I might just pop in. My organization, Ed Redesign at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, has a whole program called Success Planning. And the idea behind success planning is to attack the one-size-fits-all sort of norm that prevails in schools, is that we'll just batch process, mass produce education. And since they were all born at roughly the same time, they must all have roughly the same needs, and we'll just teach to the average. And so it's basically the idea that every child needs an individualized education plan that takes into account not just the factors inside of school that make for academic progress, but takes into account that student's interests, assets, and challenges outside of school. And what does it take to, when you look 360 degrees, 365 days a year, to move that student towards well-being? And this, therefore, has to engage the outside world, not just the school world, on an issue like homelessness. We need to fundamentally provide different kinds of services and supports and opportunities to homeless children than we do to the average child, because a homeless child's challenges are significantly greater. And therefore, we've got to develop the muscles to differentiate and personalize in ways that meet children where they are and give them what they need, both inside and outside of school, in order to be successful.
I'd add that to do that, though, educators have to teach the students they have, not the students they want or dream about. So I think there's a reality check for educators, particularly as you move up the education chain, because I think many educators think they're teaching themselves. They have to teach the students that are there, meeting those students where they are, not complaining about where they are, finding them where they are, and respecting where they are, and teaching them for where they are.
I just want to add, first of all, thank you for Carol, bringing up about, the McKinney-Vento Act. I'm somewhat familiar with that, particularly with those that are seriously mentally ill, because we're utilizing the act for many years to developing what we call shelter plus care. We know the importance not only have a roof above your head, but we also understand that there's continual support that the person needs. I just want to highlight the other thing is that I'm pretty sure in many states are committed to, in regard to the act, and has probably dedicated funding. I've just recently encountered a program in Boston, is a housing stabilization program, which actually is interesting. I think that just by this question, it raised to me, again, earlier when we talk about the division of labor. I really hope that if we have the right workforce in a school system, that would be something a school social worker would do for this particular student and families. So I think that's what I think is important, to have that division of labor. And I have to say that we need to have the ratio of, number of social workers to the number of students. And this is particularly true for, the type of school, level 1 or whatever the school is, that have high needs, because we know that those are the social determinants of success in education and in learning. So I just want to highlight that. The one thing I do want to, that brought into my thinking now is that, these are wonderful safety net programs, but what happened, and some of you are participating in this might know more than I do, is that there's nothing about prevention of homelessness. The housing stabilization program is after the child and the family lost their home, they go into very now time limited amount of time to be in these shelter plus program. And then they are being then forced into, and also the providers too that provide these programs has to force the family and children to, find themselves with help, to find an apartment. But interesting enough that often that comes into saying that, well, I couldn't find any place to live in Boston because Boston is too expensive to rent an apartment. So guess what? They are being sent into other gateway cities that are have lower, let's say, cost of living and so forth. But they never thought about how's that impact the child. If a child already established relationship in Boston in a school, and they somehow being, so to speak, have to move into another area for a period of time, what is that loss of relationship for that child that already established? I just want to kind of highlight that aspect of it.
Thank you all so much. Very, very insightful remarks. While you were all speaking, we received a comment from Claire, and I thought I'd just read it and see what everyone thinks about this relatively quickly so that we can move on to some of the other questions. But Claire says, in part, the school leader should be the person that develops relationships with teachers, parents, and community members, that works to address the relationships between these groups and have discussions about what would allow each of these groups to express how they see their role in the school and what they can contribute to the school. Your thoughts, your reactions to that? I mean, is this a role that should be occupied by school leaders? Are school leaders doing that work now, or is there room to improve?
I think, partnerships are hard work, and it's relationship building, it's time consuming. It takes a lot of energy. Schools can do better at that, but there's a capacity issue. Who does it? Our principals are already straight out. If you follow a principal through a typical day at one of our schools, they're straight out and responding to the brush fires that come up each and every day. So I think there need to be larger sort of systemic partnerships that are negotiated at a citywide or certainly at a neighborhood level. We talk about the problem of homelessness. If you're a second grade teacher and you find out the little girl in the back of the classroom who's asleep on the desk is actually living in the back seat of her car right now, and you're a teacher and you want to do something to alleviate that, it's horrible for the kid, and she's not going to learn anything in your classroom until you rectify that situation, but you really don't have a clue as to what to do about it. And you pick up the phone and you call your assistant principal, and they don't really know what to do about it. And we need systems citywide where somebody can pick up a phone in a situation like this, draw attention to this child, but not have to feel that the school is obligated to do this themselves. And this is what I was getting at earlier in the school-centric question, is we need much more robust partnerships mediated and curated at the citywide level. We're pushing the development of children's cabinets in cities all across the country, where you get the mayor to convene all the grassroots players who care about children and children's well-being and bring them to the table and say, how do we collaborate more effectively to serve our families and to serve our children?
So I don't disagree about the value of cabinets, but I do think school leaders have a responsibility for the culture within their school and to role model what kind of treatment we should have towards each other as peers, and parents to educators, educators to students, administrators to teachers, across all that. And I think leaders must be responsible for the culture within their halls and in their places and spaces. And I think we owe it to our schools to have leaders who see that as part of their responsibility. If all you do is put out brush fires, you're missing your job. When I started as a college president, I had more somebody said to me, you're like a firefighter on a hillside of fires. Like, stop already. I said, but I got all these problems. And they said, no, you will have those problems from now until this job ends. Your real job is to develop a culture within this community that makes people want to learn and be there and grow and flourish. That's your job. Go do your job. Ooh, that was a pretty harsh criticism, and not wrong.
Anyone else like to weigh in on this, or should we move on?
I will just say, I agree with Claire. In our school district, we definitely, this is post-pandemic, so I'm excited. This is another positive. Where our school used to, prior to a pandemic, our school would have weekly, the leadership team would meet weekly and discuss probably just school business. But after the pandemic, it stopped being just school business and it became a team, a well-being team, or it would be a absenteeism team. These things became in the forefront. They didn't just fall underneath school business anymore. They took their own team and applied it. And that was great, because that means that teachers have the ability to just type in a name and what they think might be happening with the student, and then that team investigates. That didn't happen before. So it's almost like an immediate response. So that well-being team is so important and imperative to our school working. It deals with behaviors, it deals with homelessness, it deals with even with students who have issues with glasses. We have so many students who can't afford glasses. It's insane at my school. But it immediately starts the ball rolling, and we start to go and involve our community and everybody, all hands on deck for that student. So I will say, yes, Claire, you're right. And I'm hoping that more schools and more school districts have started these things, because that was an immediate positive that started at our school. So now I know if I ever even question anything about a student, homelessness, anything like that, they attack it. And Dr. Wang, I just wanted to say, when there is a student who is homeless and they do move, I had a student, he was dealing with a lot, he became homeless, he was dealing with domestic abuse at home. They moved him far away, but he was allowed to stay at our school for 3 years, despite being in a whole different district. They made sure his education stayed intact. So there's things out there, but we also as educators have to inquire, or we have to push for these programs to be in our buildings so that they're available to our students.
And I absolutely agree with you that we have to push, actually, at the micro level, we have to push. If not, everyone is saying, okay, this is what's going to be. You move to a city 25 miles away. Well, the kids is going to be enrolled in that school district now, and not in the school district. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of these push, unfortunately, has to be at the micro, local level or individual level, and it's not an overall policy, at least to understand that it is hard for children to miss their friends because they're being sent away now, because the family have to move. And guess what? The family that have that housing needs tends to move a lot. And guess what? The child is growing up in an environment of transitions after transition after transition. With that said, I just want to make and this is the wicked problem. I think it's that I do agree both in terms of what Karen said and also what Paul said. I do not believe a school can address all the social determinants that many of our families encounter. It has to be collaborative and partnership. So it is not school-centric, it is community-centric in that sense. And I do believe that leaders within a school can set a lot of examples of being a leader of that. And I have no doubt, that their communities at the local level have done some good work in this area in regard to how do we capitalize the community network, the capital of a community, to bring forward, optimizing, our students' learning.
Thank you. Thank you all. We have so many great questions that we didn't get to, but we are indeed past time at this point, so we do have to wrap it up. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Perhaps Karen and Ed, we can explore looking at some of these topics in a blog post that we can share on our website. But in any case, thank you all so much for your insights and your expertise. Thank you to the audience for joining us. A reminder, you can get 20% off the book with the code MEND24 at the Teachers College Press website. And we will be sending a recording of this chat as well as details of that discount to all attendees within a few business days. So please look out for that. Thank you all so much. Take care.